Picture this, you wake up every morning knowing your job is to collect human waste with your bare hands, or maybe let blood-sucking leeches attach to your body for hours. What if I told you these weren't punishments, but actual paying jobs that people did to survive? And wait until you hear about the woman who became rich from the most disgusting work imaginable. The medieval period, roughly from 500 to 1500 AD, was a time when people had to get creative about making money. And by creative, I mean they took on some of the most stomach-churning, dangerous, and downright bizarre jobs you can imagine. Today we're diving deep into 10 medieval occupations that were so disgusting, so weird, and so risky that they'll make your worst Monday morning feel like a vacation. But here's what shocked me most while researching this. Some of these workers live better than nobles. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never complain about your job again. Life in medieval times wasn't like the movies. There were no noble knights everywhere, no clean castles, and definitely no romantic adventures. For most people, it was about pure survival. The average person lived in filthy conditions, disease was everywhere, and if you didn't work, you didn't eat. But here's the thing, society still needed certain jobs done, no matter how awful they were. Someone had to clean up the mess, literally and figuratively. And that someone was usually the poorest, most desperate people in society. The medieval world created a unique ecosystem where the most disgusting jobs often paid the best, if you could stomach them. These weren't just side gigs or temporary work. These were full-time careers that people built their entire lives around. Families would pass these trades down through generations, creating dynasties of people who specialized in humanity's dirtiest work. What made these jobs even more challenging was the lack of proper tools, safety equipment, or medical knowledge. People were essentially going into battle against disease, danger, and disgust armed with nothing but primitive tools and sheer desperation. Yet somehow they found ways to not just survive, but in some cases thrive. Think of medieval society like a giant machine. Every gear had to turn for the whole thing to work. And some of those gears were covered in things you don't want to imagine. 1. The gong farmer, the night soil specialist. Let's start with what might be the most universally disgusting job in medieval history, the gong farmer. Now, despite the name, these people weren't farming anything you'd want to eat. They were the human waste removal specialists of their time, and their work was as nasty as it sounds. Every medieval town and city had public latrines and private garderobe facilities. These weren't connected to any kind of sewer system like we have today. Instead, waste just accumulated in pits and tanks underneath these facilities. Over time, these pits would fill up completely, creating a health hazard that could spread disease throughout the entire community. This is where the gong farmers came in. Their job was to climb down into these waste pits, usually at night to avoid disturbing the public, and manually shovel out years' worth of accumulated human excrement. They'd work by torchlight or moonlight, standing knee-deep or sometimes waist-deep in waste that had been fermenting for months or even years. The smell was so intense that gong farmers often couldn't work for more than a few hours at a time without becoming physically ill. Many developed permanent breathing problems from the toxic gases that built up in these confined spaces. Some actually died from asphyxiation when they encountered pockets of methane gas that had built up over time. But here's the interesting part, gong farmers were actually paid quite well for their services. In London during the 14th century, a gong farmer could earn more in a single night than many craftsmen made in a week. The city authorities knew that without these workers, disease would spread rapidly through the population, so they were willing to pay premium wages for this essential service. I have to admit, when I first started researching these jobs, I thought surely no one could make a living doing this. But then I found records of a gong farmer named Richard the Raker who owned 3 houses and employed a team of workers. The man literally built an empire on other people's waste. The work was highly regulated too. Gong farmers could only work at night, and they had to transport the waste outside the city limits before dawn. They couldn't live within the city walls and had to follow strict rules about where they could and couldn't go during their off hours. Society both needed them and wanted to keep them at arm's length. Most gong farmers worked in teams of 3 to 5 people. They'd use primitive tools like long-handled spades, buckets, and carts to remove and transport the waste. The waste itself, called night soil, was actually valuable as fertilizer for farms outside the city. So gong farmers often had 2 sources of income. They got paid by the city to remove the waste, and then they got paid by farmers to deliver it. The job was often hereditary, passed down from father to son, because it was so difficult to find people willing to do it. Entire families would be involved in the trade, with different family members specializing in different aspects of the work. Some would focus on the actual excavation, others on transportation, and others on sales to agricultural customers. Working conditions were incredibly dangerous beyond just the obvious health hazards. The pits were often deep and unstable, with walls that could collapse without warning. Workers had to be careful not to fall into the waste, which could be deep enough to drown in. They also had to watch out for rats, which were everywhere in these environments and could carry deadly diseases. Despite all these challenges, many Gong farmers took pride in their work. They saw themselves as essential workers who kept their communities healthy and functioning. Some even became relatively wealthy by medieval standards, able to afford better housing and food than many other working-class people. But here's what I keep wondering, and we'll explore this more as we go through these jobs. How do people mentally cope with work that society both needed and despised? 2. The leech collector living bay for medical purposes. Now let's talk about a job that was almost exclusively done by women, and it involved deliberately letting parasites attach to your body for hours at a time. Leech collecting was a legitimate profession in medieval times, and it was exactly as horrible as it sounds. Medical leeching was a common practice throughout the medieval period. Doctors believed that many illnesses were caused by having too much blood in the body, so they would use leeches to remove excess blood from patients. This created a constant demand for fresh, healthy leeches, and somebody had to catch them. Leech collectors, almost always poor women, would wade into swamps, marshes, and stagnant ponds where leeches lived. They'd wear minimal clothing, often just a simple dress, or sometimes they'd work in their undergarments, because they needed the leeches to have access to their skin. Then they'd stand perfectly still in the water, sometimes for hours, waiting for leeches to attach themselves to their legs, arms, and sometimes their entire body. The process was incredibly uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Leeches inject an anticoagulant when they bite, which means the wounds continue bleeding even after the leech is removed. A collector might have dozens of leeches attached to her body at one time, and each one would leave a bleeding wound that could take hours to stop bleeding completely. Beyond the immediate discomfort, there were serious health risks involved. Standing in stagnant water for extended periods exposed collectors to all sorts of diseases. The water was often contaminated with human and animal waste and contained bacteria and parasites that could cause serious infections. Many collectors developed chronic leg problems, skin conditions, and other health issues from prolonged exposure to these unsanitary conditions. But here's where this story gets really interesting. I found records of a leech collector named Margaret the Bloody, who worked the marshes outside Canterbury. She was so skilled at her trade that she supplied leeches to medical schools across 3 different counties. By the time she died, she owned more property than most merchants in her town. The leeches themselves weren't the only creatures in these environments. Collectors had to deal with snakes, rats, and other dangerous animals that also lived in marshy areas. Some collectors were bitten by venomous snakes or contracted diseases from rat bites. Others accidentally stepped on sharp objects hidden in the murky water. But like many of the worst medieval jobs, leech collecting paid relatively well because it was so unpleasant and dangerous. A skilled collector who could gather large quantities of healthy leeches could earn enough to support herself, and often her family too. In some areas, successful collectors could earn more than seamstresses, servants, or other jobs typically available to women. The work required a lot of skill and knowledge that isn't immediately obvious. Collectors had to know which types of leeches were best for medical use, how to identify healthy versus diseased leeches, and how to store and transport them without damaging them. They also had to understand the habits of leeches when they were most active, what conditions they preferred, and how to encourage them to attach quickly. Different types of leeches were used for different medical purposes, and collectors needed to understand these distinctions. Some leeches were better for treating headaches, others for joint pain, and still others for general bloodletting. The most valuable leeches were those that could remove blood quickly and cleanly without causing excessive pain to patients. Collectors developed various techniques to make their work more efficient. Some would rub their skin with certain substances to make themselves more attractive to leeches. Others would identify the most productive locations and return to them regularly. Many collectors worked in teams, sharing information about where the best leeches could be found and helping each other when someone got into trouble in the water. The storage and transportation of leeches was another specialized skill. Leeches had to be kept alive and healthy until they were sold to doctors or medical practitioners. This required proper containers, the right water conditions, and careful handling. Dead or diseased leeches were worthless, so collectors had to master the art of keeping their harvest in good condition. Many collectors worked seasonally, focusing on leech collecting during the warmer months when the creatures were most active and finding other work during the winter. Some supplemented their income by collecting other items from marshes and swamps, like certain types of plants or minerals that had medicinal value. I can't help but think about the psychological strength it must have taken to do this work. Not just the physical discomfort, but the knowledge that you were literally feeding parasites with your own blood to make a living. But wait until you hear about the next job, because if you think letting leeches drink your blood is bad, what about someone who believed they were consuming the sins of dead people? 3. The sin eater, spiritual waste management. Here's a job that was less about physical disgust and more about spiritual horror, the sin eater. This was a person who was paid to literally consume the sins of dead people, taking on their spiritual burden so the deceased could rest peacefully in the afterlife. The practice of sin eating was based on medieval Christian beliefs about sin, death, and salvation. People believed that when someone died with unconfessed or unforgiven sins, their soul will be trapped in purgatory or worse. Families who could afford it would hire a sin eater to perform a ritual that would transfer the deceased person's sins to the sin eater, freeing the dead person's soul to enter heaven. The ritual itself was straightforward but deeply symbolic. The sin eater would come to the house where the dead person lay, usually shortly before the funeral. A meal would be prepared, typically bread and beer or ale, and placed on or near the body of the deceased. The sin eater would then eat and drink everything while reciting prayers or incantations, symbolically consuming the sins along with the food. What made this job particularly horrifying wasn't the physical act, but the spiritual and social implications. Sin eaters were believed to be taking on genuine spiritual corruption, accumulating the sins of dozens or hundreds of people over their careers. Most people believed that sin eaters were damning themselves to hell in order to save others, which meant they were both essential and completely ostracized by their communities. The social isolation of sin eaters was extreme. Most people were terrified to interact with them, believing that being near a sin eater could somehow transfer spiritual corruption. Sin eaters often lived alone on the outskirts of communities, had difficulty finding spouses, and were banned from most churches and religious ceremonies. They were simultaneously necessary and reviled. Now here's a story that really stuck with me. There was a sin eater named Thomas the Damned who worked in Wales during the 15th century. According to local records, he consumed the sins of over 200 people during his career. When he finally died, the local priest refused to bury him in consecrated ground. But here's the twist: his own family hired another sin eater to consume his sins at his funeral. Even in death, he couldn't escape what he'd become. Despite this isolation, sin eaters were usually paid quite well for their services. Wealthy families might pay a sin eater enough for a single ritual to live comfortably for months. The payment was seen not just as compensation for services, but as a form of charity that might help balance out some of the spiritual damage the sin eater was taking on. Most sin eaters were men, often people who had already been marginalized by society for other reasons. Some were former criminals, others were people with physical disabilities or mental illnesses that made other work difficult. Becoming a sin eater was often a last resort for people who had no other way to make a living. The psychological toll of this work was enormous. Sin eaters had to live with the constant belief that they were accumulating spiritual corruption that would damn them for eternity. Many sin eaters became alcoholics or developed other self-destructive behaviors, which people interpreted as evidence that the sins they had consumed were affecting them. Interestingly, some sin eaters found ways to rationalize their work that made it more psychologically bearable. Some believed that by taking on the sins of others, they were performing a Christ-like act of self-sacrifice that might actually earn them spiritual rewards. Others developed personal religious practices or rituals that they believed helped protect them from the spiritual damage they were taking on. The foods used in sin-eating rituals were carefully chosen for their symbolic meaning. Bread represented the body of Christ and was believed to have special power to absorb spiritual corruption. Beer or ale was associated with life and vitality and was thought to help wash away sins. Some rituals also included salt, which was believed to have purifying properties. Different regions had different traditions about how sin eating should be performed. In some areas, the ritual had to be completed before sunrise after the person died. In others, it was done immediately before the funeral procession began. Some traditions required the sin eater to eat in complete silence, while others involved specific prayers or chants. Sin eaters often specialized in working with specific types of deaths. Some focused on people who had died suddenly without receiving last rites. Others specialized in people who had died violently or under suspicious circumstances. The most experienced sin eaters were called in for particularly complex cases, like people who were believed to have committed serious crimes or who had died while excommunicated from the church. If I'm being honest, this job haunts me more than any of the others. The physical jobs were horrible, but at least when you went home, you could wash off the filth. But how do you wash off spiritual corruption that you genuinely believe will damn your soul forever? But speaking of things that are hard to wash off, wait until you meet the medieval pest control specialists who had to deal with creatures that could destroy entire cities. 4. The rat catcher medieval pest control specialist. Rats were one of the biggest problems in medieval cities and towns. They carried diseases, contaminated food supplies, and reproduced incredibly quickly. Someone had to deal with them, and that someone was the rat catcher, a person who made their living hunting down and killing rats using methods that range from clever to absolutely insane. Rat catchers were essential workers in medieval society because rats weren't just a nuisance. They were a genuine threat to public health and food security. Rats could destroy entire grain stores, contaminate water supplies, and spread diseases like the plague that could kill thousands of people. Communities that didn't have effective rat control often faced famine and epidemic diseases. The tools and methods used by rat catchers were incredibly varied and often quite creative. Some rat catchers specialized in using traps, which they would craft themselves from wood, metal, and other materials. These traps ranged from simple snap traps to elaborate contraptions that could catch dozens of rats at once. Skilled trap makers were highly valued because effective traps could dramatically reduce rat populations without requiring constant human intervention. Other rat catchers preferred more active hunting methods. They would use specially trained dogs, usually small, agile breeds that were good at catching rats in tight spaces. These dogs were incredibly valuable to their owners and were often treated better than most people treated their children. A good rat-catching dog could earn its owner a comfortable living and was sometimes worth more than a year's wages for an average worker. Some rat catchers used even more exotic methods. There are records of rat catchers who kept tame snakes that they would release into areas with heavy rat infestations. The snakes would hunt the rats naturally, and the rat catcher would collect payment based on how many dead rats were found afterward. This method was risky because snakes weren't always easy to control, and sometimes they would disappear or turn on their handlers. Here's a story that perfectly captures how crazy this job could get. There was a rat catcher in London named Jack the Weasel who claimed he could communicate with rats and convince them to leave voluntarily. Sounds ridiculous, right? But he was so successful that the city paid him a retainer for over 20 years. Whether he actually talked to rats or just understood their behavior better than anyone else, his methods worked. Poison was another common tool, though medieval poisons were primitive and often dangerous to humans as well as rats. Rat catchers would mix various toxic substances with foods that rats found attractive, then place these baits in areas where rats were known to gather. The challenge was creating poisons that were effective against rats but wouldn't harm cats, dogs, or humans who might accidentally consume them. Many rat catchers developed their own secret recipes for rat poison, and these formulas were closely guarded trade secrets. Some used arsenic, which was available but expensive. Others experimented with various plant-based toxins or combinations of substances that they believed would be particularly effective. The most successful rat catchers often became wealthy by selling their poison recipes to other pest control workers. The work was incredibly dangerous for several reasons. First, rats themselves could be dangerous, especially when cornered or in large groups. Rat catchers were frequently bitten, and these bites often became infected or transmitted diseases. Some rat catchers died from infections caused by rat bites, while others contracted serious illnesses like typhus or plague from their exposure to infected rats. Working in the environments where rats thrived was also hazardous. Rat catchers often had to crawl through sewers, climb into grain storage areas, or work in basements and cellars that were poorly ventilated and structurally unsound. Many rat catchers were injured in falls or cave-ins, and some were overcome by toxic gases that built up in confined spaces. The psychological aspects of the job were challenging too. Rat catchers had to be comfortable working in dark, confined spaces filled with aggressive animals. They also had to deal with the constant presence of death and decay, since their work often involved cleaning up areas where rats had died or where rat infestations had caused serious damage. Despite these challenges, skilled rat catchers were well-respected and well-paid members of their communities. Cities and towns often employed rat catchers on a full-time basis, providing them with steady income and sometimes even housing. Private businesses like bakeries, breweries, and grain merchants also hired rat catchers regularly to protect their facilities from infestations. Some rat catchers became quite wealthy and influential. The most successful ones often employed teams of assistants and operated what were essentially pest control businesses. They would contract with multiple clients, manage large territories, and sometimes even train other people in rat catching techniques. Different rat catchers developed different specializations within the field. Some focused on preventive work, helping clients modify their buildings and storage areas to make them less attractive to rats. Others specialized in emergency response, being called in when rat infestations had already become serious problems. The most elite rat catchers worked for wealthy clients like nobles or merchants, dealing with rat problems in palaces, manor houses, and expensive commercial facilities. The relationship between rat catchers and their communities was fascinating. People depended on them completely, but also kept their distance because of the diseases and filth associated with their work. It was like they were essential, but contaminated at the same time. But if you think dealing with rats was challenging, wait until you hear about the person whose job was to control an entirely different type of pest, one that walked on 4 legs and had no respect for religious ceremonies. 5. The dog whipper, church security with a twist. Medieval churches had an unusual problem that required an equally unusual solution. Dogs would frequently wander into church services, disrupting prayers, stealing food, fighting with each other, and generally causing chaos during religious ceremonies. The solution was to hire someone whose entire job was to remove disruptive dogs from church services, and that person was called a dog whipper. Dog whippers were official church employees, usually appointed by the local parish and paid from church funds. They attended every church service, standing ready to spring into action whenever a dog entered the sacred space. Their primary tool was a long whip or staff that they used to drive dogs out of the church, though the best dog whippers prided themselves on being able to remove dogs without causing too much disruption to the ongoing service. The job required a unique combination of skills. Dog whippers needed to be quick and agile enough to catch dogs that might be running around the church, but they also needed to be quiet and respectful enough to do their work without disturbing the religious proceedings. They had to understand dog behavior well enough to predict how different dogs would react to being confronted, and they needed to be strong enough to physically remove large or aggressive dogs when necessary. Working conditions for dog whippers were actually quite pleasant compared to most medieval jobs. They spent their time in relatively clean, safe environments, and their work schedule was predictable. They knew exactly when they would be needed because church services were held at regular times. They also had a certain level of social respectability because they were officially employed by the church. However, the job had its challenges. Some dogs were more difficult to remove than others, especially if they belonged to wealthy or influential parishioners who might object to having their pets roughly handled. Dog whippers had to learn to navigate the complex social dynamics of their communities, understanding which dogs could be whipped and which needed to be handled more delicately. Here's a story that shows just how complicated this job could become. There was a dog whipper named Brother Francis who worked at a cathedral in York. One Sunday, a large mastiff belonging to a powerful local lord wandered into the church during communion. The dog knocked over several elderly parishioners and ate the communion bread right off the altar. Brother Francis had to physically wrestle the mastiff out of the church while the entire congregation watched. The Lord was so embarrassed that he donated enough money to build a new chapel just to apologize for his dog's behavior. Different churches had different policies about how dogs should be handled. Some insisted that dogs be removed immediately and forcefully, regardless of who owned them. Others preferred a more diplomatic approach, where dog whippers would try to quietly guide dogs toward the exit without using force. The most challenging positions were in churches that served diverse communities with very different attitudes toward animals and church decorum. Some dog whippers became quite skilled at reading both human and canine behavior. They learned to identify which dogs were likely to cause problems before they actually did anything disruptive, allowing them to remove potential troublemakers before they disturbed the service. They also learned to recognize the social dynamics that might affect their work, understanding which parishioners might object to having their dogs removed and finding ways to handle those situations diplomatically. The tools used by dog whippers varied depending on local preferences and church policies. Some used traditional whips, which were effective but could be quite loud and disruptive. Others preferred long staffs or poles that could be used to guide dogs without making noise. Some dog whippers carried treats or other incentives that they could use to encourage dogs to leave voluntarily rather than having to force them out. Many dog whippers supplemented their income by providing other services to their churches or communities. Some also worked as general church maintenance workers, cleaning the building and maintaining church property. Others provided security services during church events or help with crowd control during large religious festivals. The social dynamics of being a dog whipper were complex. On one hand, they were respected church employees doing important work that helped maintain the dignity of religious services. On the other hand, their job was somewhat ridiculous, and they were often the subject of jokes and mockery from community members who found the whole concept of a professional dog remover amusing. Some dog whippers took great pride in their work and developed sophisticated techniques for managing their responsibilities. They would study the habits of regular canine visitors to their churches, learning which dogs were likely to cause problems and developing specific strategies for dealing with each one. The most skilled dog whippers could remove a disruptive dog so smoothly that most parishioners wouldn't even notice what had happened. The position of dog whippers sometimes became hereditary, with fathers passing the job down to their sons. This created families that specialized in canine management and developed extensive knowledge about dog behavior and church protocols over generations. Some of these families became quite respected within their communities for their expertise and professionalism. Looking back on this job, I realize it represents something important about medieval society. They found practical solutions to every problem, no matter how small or seemingly ridiculous. They didn't just accept chaos, they appointed someone to deal with it systematically. But speaking of systematic approaches to unusual problems, our next job involved providing a service that might seem completely unnecessary to us today, but was absolutely essential in a world without mechanical timekeeping. 6. The knocker-up human alarm clock service. Before mechanical alarm clocks were widely available, people who needed to wake up at specific times had to rely on human alarm clocks, and that's exactly what knocker-ups provided. These were people who made their living by going around to their clients' homes in the early morning hours, knocking on windows, doors, or shutters to wake people up for work or other appointments. The knocker-up profession emerged because medieval work schedules were often quite rigid, especially for people who worked in trades that required coordination with others. Bakers needed to start work before dawn to have fresh bread ready when shops opened. Market vendors needed to arrive early to set up their stalls before customers began shopping. Farmers needed to start work at specific times to make the most of available daylight. All of these people needed reliable ways to wake up on time, and knocker-ups provided that service. Most knocker-ups worked in the pre-dawn hours, typically starting their rounds around 3 or 4 a.m. and finishing by 6 or 7 a.m. They would carry long sticks or poles that they used to tap on second-story windows, or they might throw small pebbles at windows to wake their clients. The skill was in making enough noise to wake the person inside without disturbing the neighbors or causing property damage. Different knocker-ups developed different techniques for doing their job effectively. Some used long bamboo poles or lightweight wooden sticks that could reach second-story windows without making too much noise. Others preferred to use small stones or dried peas that they could throw accurately at specific windows. The most skilled knocker-ups could wake their intended client without disturbing anyone else in the building. The job required excellent timekeeping skills and a very reliable internal clock. Knocker-ups had to wake up earlier than anyone else in their community and maintain consistent schedules regardless of weather conditions, personal health, or other challenges. Many knocker-ups developed sophisticated systems for tracking their clients and their schedules, often using primitive record-keeping methods to ensure they didn't forget anyone. Here's where this job gets really interesting. I found records of a knocker-up named William the Rooster who serviced over 100 clients in medieval London. He was so reliable that some of the city's most important merchants wouldn't make major business decisions without consulting his schedule first. When he finally retired, it took 3 different people to replace him, and even then they couldn't match his precision. Client relationships were crucial to success as a knocker-up. Regular customers provided steady income, but they also had high expectations for reliability and consistency. A knocker-up who failed to wake an important client on time might lose not just that customer, but their reputation in the community. The best knocker-ups built strong relationships with their clients, learning their preferences and adapting their techniques to each person's specific needs. Some knocker-ups specialized in serving particular types of clients. Some focused on wealthy merchants or professionals who could afford to pay premium rates for reliable wake-up services. Others worked primarily with laborers and craftsmen who needed to start work early but couldn't afford expensive timepieces. The most successful knocker-ups often served diverse clienteles, balancing high-paying premium customers with volume business from working-class clients. The tools used by knocker-ups were simple but important. Long poles needed to be lightweight enough to carry easily, but sturdy enough to reach high windows and make sufficient noise. Some knocker-ups carried multiple types of tools for different situations, soft tapping implements for clients who woke easily, and more substantial noisemakers for heavy sleepers. Many also carried small lanterns or torches to help them navigate dark streets safely. Working as a knocker-up involved significant physical challenges. The job required walking several miles each morning, often through dark streets that might be muddy, icy, or otherwise treacherous. Knocker-ups had to work in all-weather conditions, from freezing winter mornings to hot summer dawns. They also needed to be physically fit enough to reach high windows and make the repetitive motions required for their work. The social aspects of being a knocker-up were interesting. They were generally respected members of their communities because they provided an essential service that helped other people maintain their livelihoods. However, they also had to be careful about their interactions with clients, especially when waking people in their night clothes or dealing with clients who were grumpy or disoriented when awakened. Safety was always a concern for knocker-ups. Walking alone through dark streets in the early morning hours made them potential targets for criminals. They also had to be careful not to be mistaken for burglars or other troublemakers by people who might not recognize them. Many knocker-ups developed relationships with local authorities and made sure they were well known in their communities to avoid these problems. Some knocker-ups expanded their services beyond simple wake-up calls. They might deliver messages, check on elderly or sick clients, or provide other early morning services that took advantage of their regular rounds through the community. The most entrepreneurial knocker-ups sometimes became informal neighborhood coordinators, helping to organize community activities and maintain communication between neighbors. The business aspects of being a knocker-up were relatively straightforward. Most charged weekly or monthly fees for regular service, with rates varying based on the difficulty of the wake-up call and the client's ability to pay. Some knocker-ups offered emergency or one-time services for special occasions, usually at premium rates. The most successful ones built steady client bases that provided predictable income over extended periods. When I think about knocker-ups, they remind me of the unsung heroes of any society, the people who do simple but essential work that keeps everything else functioning. Without them, the entire economic system of medieval towns could have collapsed from people oversleeping. But if you think waking people up was morally complex, wait until you hear about people whose work involved the ultimate moral boundary, the line between life and death. 7. The resurrectionist grave robbing for science. Perhaps no medieval job was more morally complex than that of the resurrectionist, also known as a body snatcher. These were people who made their living by digging up recently buried corpses and selling them to medical schools, doctors, and other people who needed cadavers for anatomical study and research. The resurrectionist trade emerged because of a fundamental conflict between medical education and religious beliefs. Doctors and medical students needed human cadavers to understand anatomy and learn surgical techniques, but the church and most of society believed that disturbing the dead was morally wrong and spiritually dangerous. This created a situation where there was high demand for cadavers, but very limited legal supply. Most resurrectionists worked at night, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection while they dug up graves. They typically targeted recently buried bodies, because these were in better condition for medical use and hadn't yet begun to decompose significantly. The work was physically demanding, requiring several hours of digging to reach a coffin, then carefully extracting the body without damaging it too severely. The tools used by resurrectionists were specialized for their particular needs. They used spades and shovels designed to work quietly, often wrapping the metal parts in cloth to muffle the sound. They carried ropes or straps for pulling bodies up out of graves, and sometimes used pulleys or other mechanical devices to make the extraction process easier. Many also carried weapons for protection, since their work made them targets for both law enforcement and angry community members. Working conditions were extremely unpleasant, even by medieval standards. Resurrectionists had to work in graveyards at night, often in bad weather, digging through dirt that might be muddy, frozen, or contaminated with disease. They handled decomposing bodies that could be infected with various diseases, and they worked in constant fear of being caught by authorities or attacked by people who discovered what they were doing. The health risks were enormous. Resurrectionists were exposed to all sorts of diseases from the corpses they handled, and many died from infections contracted through their work. They also risked injuries from their digging tools, falls into grave sites, and violence from people who caught them in the act. Some resurrectionists were killed by angry mobs who discovered them robbing graves. Here's a story that shows just how dangerous this work could be. There was a team of resurrectionists in Edinburgh who called themselves the Merchants of Death. They had been successfully supplying bodies to medical schools for over 5 years when they made a fatal mistake. They decided to rob the grave of a prominent merchant's daughter on the very night of her funeral. The family had hired guards to watch the grave, and when the resurrectionists arrived, they were caught in the act. 2 of them were beaten to death on the spot, and the third was hanged the next morning. Despite these risks, the work paid extremely well. Medical schools and private doctors were willing to pay substantial sums for fresh cadavers, sometimes more than most people earned in several months of legitimate work. This high pay attracted people who were desperate for money or who were already operating outside the law and weren't concerned about adding grave robbing to their criminal activities. The business relationships in the resurrectionist trade were complex and secretive. Resurrectionists usually worked with specific doctors or medical institutions that would purchase their products regularly. These relationships required a high degree of trust, since both parties were engaged in illegal activities and could be severely punished if caught. Payment was usually made in cash, and transactions were conducted in secret locations away from public scrutiny. Many resurrectionists worked in teams, with different people specializing in different aspects of the work. Some were experts at quickly and quietly digging up graves, others specialized in transporting bodies without being detected, and still others focused on maintaining relationships with buyers and managing the business side of the operation. The most successful resurrectionist operations were well-organized criminal enterprises with sophisticated logistics and security measures. The psychological toll of this work was significant. Resurrectionists had to overcome natural human revulsion toward handling dead bodies, and they had to live with the knowledge that they were violating one of society's strongest taboos. Many became alcoholics or developed other psychological problems as ways of coping with the stress and moral conflict of their work. Different types of bodies commanded different prices in the resurrectionist market. Fresh corpses were worth more than those that had begun to decompose. Bodies of young, healthy people were more valuable than those of elderly or diseased individuals. Unusual specimens, people with rare medical conditions or physical abnormalities, could command premium prices from researchers who were interested in studying specific phenomena. Resurrectionists had to be knowledgeable about burial practices and cemetery operations to be successful. They needed to know which graves contained recently buried bodies, which cemeteries had the best security, and which times of night were safest for their operations. Many became experts at reading funeral notices and tracking burial schedules to identify the most promising targets for their activities. The legal consequences of being caught as a resurrectionist were severe. In many places, grave robbing was punishable by death or lengthy imprisonment. Even when the penalties were less severe, being identified as a body snatcher could result in social ostracism, loss of employment opportunities, and constant harassment from community members who were horrified by the practice. Some resurrectionists tried to justify their work by arguing that they were providing an essential service to medical education and research. They claimed that their activities ultimately helped save lives by enabling doctors to learn more about human anatomy and develop better treatments for diseases. However, most of society rejected these arguments and continued to view body snatching as a horrific crime against both the dead and their surviving family members. I have to be honest with you, researching this job made me question everything about how we balance progress against morality. These people were literally stealing the dead to advance medical knowledge, and some of that knowledge probably saved lives. But at what cost? But if grave robbing seems morally ambiguous, wait until you hear about a job where the worker's main qualification was their ability to drink themselves into a stupor every single day and get paid for it. The ale taster, professional drunk for quality control. In medieval times, ale and beer were dietary staples for most people, including children, because they were often safer to drink than water. This created a need for quality control to ensure that alcoholic beverages were safe, properly made, and fairly priced. The ale taster was the person responsible for this quality control, and their job involved drinking large quantities of alcohol as part of their official duties. Ale tasters were typically appointed by local governments or trade guilds, and were given legal authority to inspect and approve alcoholic beverages before they could be sold to the public. They would visit breweries, taverns, and other establishments that produced or sold ale and beer, sampling the products and making official judgments about their quality, strength, and safety. The work required extensive knowledge about brewing processes, ingredients, and quality standards. Ale tasters needed to be able to identify problems like contamination, improper fermentation, watered-down drinks, or the use of inferior ingredients. They also had to understand local regulations about alcohol content, pricing, and serving practices, and they were responsible for ensuring that businesses complied with these rules. Sampling alcoholic beverages all day long created obvious challenges. Most ale tasters developed high tolerances for alcohol out of necessity, but they still had to maintain enough sobriety to do their jobs effectively. The best ale tasters learned to pace themselves, taking small sips rather than full drinks, and spacing out their tastings throughout the day to avoid becoming completely intoxicated. The health consequences of this profession were significant. Many ale tasters developed liver problems, stomach ailments, and other health issues related to chronic alcohol consumption. Some became full-blown alcoholics, losing their ability to perform their duties effectively and sometimes dying young from alcohol-related diseases. The job had a high turnover rate because many people couldn't handle the physical and psychological demands of drinking professionally. Despite these challenges, ale tasters were important and respected members of their communities. They protected public health by identifying contaminated or dangerous beverages before they could harm consumers. They also protected consumers from fraud by identifying watered-down drinks or products made with inferior ingredients. Their work helped maintain standards in the brewing industry and ensured fair pricing for alcoholic beverages. Here's a story that perfectly captures the absurdity and importance of this job. There was an ale taster named Geoffrey the Perpetually Pickled who worked in Canterbury during the 14th century. He was legendary for being able to detect the slightest quality problems in beer, even when he was barely able to stand upright. One day, he identified a batch of ale that had been contaminated with deadly nightshade, a discovery that probably saved dozens of lives. The irony? He was so drunk when he made this discovery that he had to have someone else write his official report because he couldn't hold a pen steady. The authority held by ale tasters was considerable. They could shut down breweries or taverns that failed to meet quality standards, impose fines on businesses that violated regulations, and even have people arrested for selling dangerous or fraudulent products. This power made them influential figures in their communities, but it also made them targets for bribery attempts and threats from business owners who didn't want to comply with regulations. Different ale tasters developed different approaches to their work. Some focused primarily on safety, looking for signs of contamination or dangerous brewing practices that can make people sick. Others emphasized quality, judging beverages based on taste, aroma, and overall craftsmanship. Still others focused on regulatory compliance, ensuring that businesses followed all applicable laws and regulations about alcohol production and sales. The tools used by ale tasters were relatively simple but important. They carried official measuring cups or vessels that were calibrated to standard sizes, allowing them to accurately assess serving sizes and alcohol content. Many also carried written records where they documented their inspections and findings, creating official documentation that could be used in legal proceedings if necessary. Training for ale tasters was usually informal, with experienced tasters teaching newcomers through apprenticeship arrangements. New ale tasters would accompany veterans on their rounds, learning to identify different types of problems and understand the subtle differences between high-quality and low-quality beverages. The best training programs also included education about brewing processes, so tasters could understand what might go wrong during production. Some ale tasters specialized in particular types of establishments or beverages. Urban ale tasters might focus on large commercial breweries and busy taverns that served many customers. Rural tasters might work primarily with small, family-run operations that produced beer for local consumption. Some specialized in particular types of alcoholic beverages, developing expertise in specific brewing traditions or techniques. The social aspects of being an ale taster were complex. On one hand, they were authority figures who commanded respect and had important responsibilities. On the other hand, their job involved drinking alcohol professionally, which some people viewed as morally questionable or socially inappropriate. Many ale tasters had to navigate carefully between maintaining their professional authority and dealing with people who didn't take them seriously because of the nature of their work. Economic relationships in the ale tasting profession varied significantly depending on local arrangements. Some ale tasters were paid fixed salaries by local governments or trade organizations. Others received payment based on the number of establishments they inspected or the amount of work they completed. Some supplemented their income by providing consulting services to brewers who wanted to improve their products or comply with regulations. The seasonal nature of brewing meant that ale tasters' workloads varied throughout the year. During harvest season, when new grains were available and brewing activity increased, ale tasters might be extremely busy inspecting new products and ensuring quality standards. During slower periods, they might focus on training, record-keeping, or other administrative aspects of their work. What strikes me about ale tasters is how they represent the medieval approach to regulation. They didn't trust systems or processes, they trusted people, even if those people were drunk half the time. But speaking of people whose job was essentially performance art, our next profession involved living as a completely fake person for the entertainment of the wealthy. 9. The hermit for hire, living garden decoration. One of the strangest jobs in medieval times was that of the ornamental hermit, a person who was paid by wealthy landowners to live on their property as a kind of living decoration. These hired hermits would inhabit caves, huts, or specially built structures on the grounds of estates, where they would be seen by visitors as exotic attractions that demonstrated the landowner's wealth and sophistication. The concept of hiring hermits emerged from medieval fascination with religious asceticism and the romantic ideal of the wise hermit living in harmony with nature. Wealthy nobles and merchants wanted to associate themselves with these spiritual ideals, but rather than actually embracing ascetic lifestyles themselves, they hired other people to live as hermits on their property, creating the appearance of spiritual depth and connection to nature. Ornamental hermits were expected to maintain the appearance of religious devotion and natural wisdom. They typically wore simple robes, grew long beards, and spent their days in activities like reading, contemplating, gardening, or crafting simple items. When visitors came to the estate, the hermit would be available to be observed, sometimes from a distance and sometimes through direct interaction, depending on the specific arrangements with their employer. The living conditions for hired hermits varied significantly, depending on their employer's wealth and preferences. Some lived in elaborate artificial caves or rustic cottages that were designed to look primitive but were actually quite comfortable. Others lived in genuinely Spartan conditions, with minimal shelter and basic furnishings. Most employers provided regular meals and basic necessities, but the hermit was expected to maintain a simple lifestyle that fit the aesthetic their employer wanted to create. The psychological challenges of this work were unique and often severe. Ornamental hermits had to spend most of their time alone, with limited social interaction and entertainment. They were essentially performing a role constantly, maintaining the appearance of spiritual contemplation and natural wisdom even when they felt bored, lonely, or frustrated. Many hired hermits struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems related to their isolation and the artificial nature of their lifestyle. Employment contracts for ornamental hermits were often quite detailed and specific. Employers would specify how the hermit should dress, what activities they should engage in, how they should interact with visitors, and what behaviors were prohibited. Some contracts required hermits to never leave the property, while others allowed limited excursions for necessary errands. Many contracts included clauses about maintaining personal hygiene standards that would create the right visual impression without being genuinely offensive to visitors. Here's a story that shows how bizarre this profession could become. There was a wealthy merchant in France who hired a hermit named Brother Silence to live in an artificial grotto on his estate. The contract specified that Brother Silence could never speak, could only eat bread and water, and had to spend at least 6 hours a day visible to visitors while appearing to pray or meditate. The merchant was so proud of his hermit that he had artists paint portraits of Brother Silence in various contemplative poses, which he then sent as gifts to other wealthy friends. Brother Silence lasted 3 years before having what we would probably call a nervous breakdown and running away in the middle of the night. The social dynamics between hired hermits and their employers were complex and often uncomfortable. Hermits were simultaneously employees and entertainment, expected to be available for display when needed, but also to maintain genuine solitude and contemplation. Some employers treated their hermits with respect and genuine interest in their well-being, while others viewed them as just another type of property decoration to be managed and maintained. Pay for ornamental hermits varied widely, but successful hermits could earn quite well for their services. Wealthy employers who wanted impressive hermits for important social events might pay substantial sums for the right person. However, the work was irregular, and hermits often had difficulty finding new positions when their current employment ended. Many struggled with the transition between periods of employment and had difficulty maintaining normal social relationships due to the isolation of their work. Some hired hermits took their roles very seriously and genuinely embraced aspects of hermetic spirituality. They used their employment as an opportunity to engage in real contemplation, study, and spiritual development. These hermits often produced written works, artwork, or philosophical insights during their employment, and some became genuinely respected figures in their communities beyond their role as ornamental attractions. The authenticity question was always present in the ornamental hermit profession. Visitors and employers were often skeptical about whether hired hermits were genuinely spiritual or just acting for money. The best hermits found ways to demonstrate genuine wisdom and spiritual insight that went beyond mere performance. But many struggled with a fundamental contradiction between commercialized spirituality and authentic religious experience. Different employers had different expectations for their hermits' interactions with visitors. Some wanted hermits who could engage in philosophical discussions and demonstrate genuine learning and wisdom. Others preferred hermits who maintained mysterious silence and let visitors project their own ideas about hermetic wisdom onto them. The most versatile hermits could adapt their approach based on their employer's preferences and the specific social situations they encountered. The decline of the ornamental hermit profession began as social attitudes towards spirituality and nature changed. As genuine religious movements emerged that emphasized authentic spiritual experience over aesthetic display, the practice of hiring decorative hermits began to seem shallow and artificial. Additionally, changes in landscape design and social entertainment made other types of estate attractions more fashionable than living hermits. Many former ornamental hermits had difficulty transitioning to other types of work after their hermit careers ended. Their long periods of isolation and the unusual nature of their previous employment made it challenging to develop normal work relationships and professional skills. Some found work in related fields like gardening or caretaking, while others struggled with poverty and social isolation after losing their hermit positions. If I'm completely honest, this job fascinates and disturbs me more than almost any other on our list. These people were literally paid to pretend to be wise and spiritual for the entertainment of the wealthy. It's like the ultimate example of how money can corrupt even the most sacred things. But if you think fake spirituality is the height of medieval absurdity, wait until you meet the people who combine haircutting with life-threatening surgery in the same establishment. 10. The barber surgeon, one-stop shop for grooming and medical care. The final job on our list combined two very different services in one terrifying package: the barber surgeon. These were people who provided both haircutting and basic medical services, often using the same tools and workspace for both types of work. If you needed a shave, a tooth extraction, and a leg amputation, the barber surgeon could handle all three appointments in the same visit. The combination of barbering and surgery emerged because both professions involved working with sharp tools and required steady hands. In medieval times, formal medical education was limited and expensive, so many communities relied on barber surgeons who learned their trade through apprenticeship and practical experience rather than formal schooling. These practitioners provided essential medical services to people who couldn't afford university-trained physicians. The range of services provided by barber surgeons was enormous and often terrifying. On the grooming side, they cut hair, trimmed beards, and provided basic hygiene services like cleaning ears or removing splinters. On the medical side, they performed tooth extractions, treated wounds, set broken bones, performed amputations, removed tumors, and even conducted some types of surgery. All of this was done with minimal anesthesia and primitive sterilization techniques. The tools used by barber surgeons were multi-purpose and often quite crude by modern standards. The same razors used for shaving might also be used for making surgical incisions. Scissors for cutting hair could also be used for trimming away damaged tissue. Tweezers for grooming could double as surgical instruments for removing foreign objects from wounds. Most barber surgeons owned only a basic set of tools that they used for everything from haircuts to major surgery. Working conditions in barber surgeon shops were often unsanitary and dangerous. The same chair might be used for a haircut in the morning and a surgical procedure in the afternoon, with minimal cleaning in between. Blood, hair, and other bodily fluids would accumulate throughout the day, creating environments that were perfect for spreading disease and infection. Many patients died not from their original problems, but from infections contracted during treatment. The training process for barber surgeons was lengthy but practical. Apprentices would start by learning basic barbering skills like haircutting and shaving, then gradually take on more complex tasks like wound treatment and tooth extraction. The most advanced apprentices might eventually learn to perform amputations and other major procedures. The entire training process could take 7 to 10 years, and many apprentices didn't survive to become full practitioners. Pain management was one of the biggest challenges faced by barber surgeons. Most procedures were performed with little or no anesthesia, requiring patients to endure excruciating pain while remaining still enough for the surgeon to work effectively. Some barber surgeons used alcohol or herbal preparations to dull pain, but these were often ineffective for major procedures. Many patients died from shock caused by the pain of their treatment. Here's a story that perfectly captures the horror and absurdity of this profession. There was a barber surgeon in London named Master Bloodletter who was famous for his speed and efficiency. He claimed he could perform a complete leg amputation in under 5 minutes, which was considered remarkably fast for the time. One day, a wealthy merchant came to him for a simple tooth extraction, but Master Bloodletter was in such a hurry that he accidentally amputated the man's finger instead. When the merchant complained, Master Bloodletter reportedly said, "Well, at least now you have matching injuries." The merchant survived, but he sued Master Bloodletter for damages and won enough money to retire comfortably. The social status of barber surgeons was complicated and varied significantly depending on their skill level and clientele. Skilled practitioners who served wealthy clients could achieve considerable respectability and financial success. However, many barber surgeons were viewed with suspicion and fear because of their association with blood, pain, and death. People often sought their services out of desperation rather than confidence. Specialization within the barber surgeon profession was common, with different practitioners focusing on different types of services. Some specialized in dental work, becoming expert at tooth extraction and treatment of mouth diseases. Others focused on wound treatment and trauma care, developing skills that made them valuable during times of war or civil conflict. Still others specialized in particular types of surgery, like cataract removal or hernia repair. The business aspects of running a barber surgeon practice were complex because practitioners had to maintain supplies and equipment for both grooming and medical services. They needed to stock various types of tools, medications, bandages, and other supplies, often at considerable expense. Many also had to maintain relationships with other medical practitioners, apothecaries, and suppliers to ensure they could provide comprehensive services to their clients. Customer relationships were crucial to success as a barber surgeon because satisfied patients provided repeat business and referrals, while dissatisfied customers could destroy a practitioner's reputation quickly. The best barber surgeons developed strong bedside manner and communication skills, helping patients understand their conditions and treatments while managing their expectations about outcomes and recovery times. The legal and regulatory environment for barber surgeons was often complex and changing. Some communities had strict rules about who could perform medical procedures and what qualifications were required. Others had minimal regulation, allowing anyone to hang out a shingle and start practicing. Many barber surgeons had to navigate between different types of authorities and regulations depending on the specific services they provided. Emergency situations were common in the barber surgeon profession, and practitioners had to be prepared to handle trauma cases, emergency amputations, and other urgent medical situations with little advance notice. This required them to maintain readiness for different types of procedures and to work effectively under pressure when patients' lives were at stake. The mortality rate among barber surgeon patients was extremely high compared to modern medical standards, but it was often better than having no treatment at all. Many barber surgeons developed genuine expertise through years of experience, and some made significant contributions to medical knowledge through their practical work and innovations in technique. What gets me about barber surgeons is how they represent the medieval approach to specialization. Why have two different professionals when one person can do both jobs badly? It's like the ultimate medieval efficiency expert designed a system to maximize both convenience and terror. But here's what I keep coming back to as I think about all these jobs. How do people find the courage to do work that was so physically, emotionally, and socially challenging? Now, here's the thing that ties all these jobs together. They were absolutely essential to medieval society, but nobody wanted to do them. Each one of these positions existed because someone had to handle the dirty, dangerous, or disgusting work that kept communities functioning. Without gong farmers, cities would have been buried in waste and disease. Without leech collectors, doctors couldn't treat patients. Without rat catchers, entire food supplies would have been destroyed. But what's really fascinating is how these jobs created their own economies and social structures. The people doing the worst work often made some of the best money, because supply and demand worked in their favor. When you're the only person willing to climb into a pit of human waste or let leeches feed on your body for hours, you can pretty much name your price. These professions also show us how different medieval society was from our world today. We've completely eliminated most of these jobs through technology, sanitation systems, and modern medicine. But at the time, they represented sophisticated solutions to real problems. Medieval people weren't primitive, they were just working with the tools and knowledge they had available. The social dynamics around these jobs were incredibly complex too. Society needed these workers desperately, but also wanted to keep them at arm's length. Many of these professions created their own subcultures and communities because the people doing them were partially excluded from mainstream society. They developed their own traditions, passed skills down through families, and created support networks that helped them cope with the challenges of their work. What's even more interesting is how many of these jobs required genuine skill and expertise. Being a successful rat catcher wasn't just about being willing to deal with rats, it required understanding animal behavior, developing effective tools and techniques, and building business relationships. Sin eaters had to navigate complex spiritual and social dynamics. Barber surgeons needed years of training to develop their skills. But here's what struck me most while researching these jobs. They reveal something profound about human resilience and adaptability. These weren't just desperate people doing desperate work. Many of them were entrepreneurs who saw opportunities where others saw only problems. They developed expertise, built businesses, and some even became wealthy and respected members of their communities. Think about it like this: medieval society was like a massive organism, and these jobs were like the immune system. They dealt with all the waste, contamination, and problems that could have killed the whole organism if left untreated. They weren't glamorous, but they were absolutely vital. And here's something I realized while writing this: every single one of these jobs required the worker to sacrifice something fundamental. Gong farmers sacrificed their health and social acceptance. Leech collectors sacrificed their bodies. Sin eaters believed they were sacrificing their souls. Resurrectionists sacrificed their moral standing. Each person made a trade-off, giving up something important to provide an essential service to their community. So there you have it, 10 of the most disgusting, dangerous, and bizarre jobs from medieval times. From gong farmers wading through human waste to ornamental hermits pretending to be wise for wealthy employers, these professions show us just how different life was 500 to 1,000 years ago. What strikes me most about these jobs is that they reveal something fundamental about human nature and society. No matter how gross, dangerous, or strange a job might be, if there's enough demand for it and enough payment offered, someone will figure out how to do it. These medieval workers weren't crazy or desperate. Well, not most of them anyway. They were entrepreneurs finding ways to make money by solving problems that nobody else wanted to deal with. These professions also remind us how much our modern world depends on technology and systems that we completely take for granted. We don't need gong farmers because we have sewage systems. We don't need knocker-ups because we have alarm clocks. We don't need rat catchers in most places because we have better food storage and pest control methods. But perhaps most importantly, these jobs show us that every society has its essential workers, people who do the jobs that keep everything else functioning, even when those jobs are unpleasant, dangerous, or socially stigmatized. The medieval world couldn't have survived without its gong farmers, leech collectors, and rat catchers, just like our modern world depends on sanitation workers, medical professionals, and pest control specialists. What really gets to me is thinking about the individual people who did these jobs. They weren't just historical curiosities. They were real people with hopes, fears, and dreams who found themselves in situations where the only way to survive was to take on work that most of us can't even imagine doing. Margaret the Bloody, standing in swamps for hours letting leeches drink her blood. Richard the Raker, building a business empire on human waste. Thomas the Damned, believing he was sacrificing his soul to save others. These were real people who found ways to live with dignity and purpose, even when their work made them outcasts from the very society they were serving. The next time you're having a bad day at work, just remember, at least you're not standing waist-deep in a medieval waste pit with a shovel, or letting leeches feast on your blood for hours at a time. Sometimes perspective is everything. But more than that, these jobs remind us that human beings are incredibly adaptable and resilient. We can find ways to make a living and build meaningful lives even under the most challenging circumstances. These medieval workers faced problems that would crush most of us, but they found solutions, built communities, and somehow maintained their humanity in the process. Hit subscribe to discover more incredible stories from history that'll change how you see the world.